We're here again with Matt Art of Matt's Healthy Woods and Wildlife, and it's one of my favorite segments because there's pitifully few foresters out there that, frankly, in my opinion, are as good and also at the same time marry sustainable timber practices to leaving this rock a better place than we found it and benefiting whitetails at the same time. Matt, speaking of benefiting this rock, oak savannas. Talk to me about them, because unless I'm missing something, they are the most endangered, rapidly disappearing ecosystem there is in the Midwest.
Tallgrass prairie would probably take the cake on that, but oak savanna and tallgrass prairie are very, very interrelated. The transition.
If you don't mind, well, let's stop for a second for those that aren't aware. What is an oak savanna?
An oak savanna is going to be essentially a prairie with scattered trees. The total canopy closure will vary somewhat. It might be one tree here, one tree over there, up to approximately a 30% total canopy coverage. But the general rule is these are scattered, fully open grown trees or clusters of trees. So they have that big, robust, full canopy with a prairie dominated system all throughout.
So what you're really looking at from a wildlife standpoint is food and cover at the same time. You know, obviously your acorns are producing mast on the years that they've got good acorn crops, and at the same time as you've got cool season grasses and weeds. Forbs is the cool word for weeds, but cool season grasses and weeds, they're kicking an average of about 15% protein. So you have the food, and then between the oaks and the prairie, you've got cover as well. Okay, so how does one go about? Well, let's say we got an oak ridge back there that we want to turn into an oak savanna. How does one go about that?
The first step is going to be verify that that's the historical condition of that. Through NRCS and their soils database, they have descriptions of the historical condition, how those soils were formed. So if it was historically savanna versus closed forest versus prairie versus open woodland, that should definitely be a guide. It doesn't mean that that's the absolute end all be all, this is what you have to do, but it should guide your decisions.
Because it's going to be a heck of a lot easier fitting a square peg into a square hole.
Absolutely.
Than it is trying to force that round peg in.
Absolutely. And
not that you can't hammer on it hard enough to make it work, but you're generally speaking going to have much greater success matching what it was.
Work with what the woods gives you, and if you've got a remnant savanna in northern Missouri, that's very, very common. The oaks, cottonwoods, some hickories historically would have been located typically along the major drainages and scatter up into the adjacent hillsides. They flow into tallgrass prairie on the more exposed sites. They flow into open woodland, closed woodland, some true forest on the most protected sites. So I'm an advocate for work with what you've got, and don't try to force a particular management practice onto an area where it doesn't fit. So that's where the experienced, knowledgeable forester comes into play in identifying which areas are conducive for which type of habitat. And having a diversity of systems, not just the oak savanna, but open woodland would be the next step towards a closed forest, where savanna might be less than 30% canopy, and open woodland will be 30 to 70% canopy. Still a lot of sunlight. It's still a fire-dominated system, very open in the understory. There might be scattered pockets of shrubs that give you that good bedding cover for the deer to lay up against. And then transition into the closed woodland that has even more, it's still a fire-dominated system, but has more of a canopy coverage, into the true forest that burn very, very infrequently, a lot more high-quality timber potential in those areas. So it's really a continuum, and maintaining the different community types on the areas appropriate for that community type is a big step in the right direction.
I think that all makes a heck of a lot of sense. Now let's take a step back. We've determined that this used to be an oak savanna. It's overgrown now. It's actually, it's borderline closed canopy.
A lot of them are.
How do you go about reclaiming this?
Fire and thinning. Those are the two. As you move forward, depending on the history, you may have to reintroduce some seed, those native grasses and wildflowers. But the first steps in no particular order are fire and thinning. The thinning may be an all-at-once type of treatment. It may be a gradual over time. The one thing I would say about restoring a degraded type of a natural community, whether it's a savanna, a prairie, a woodland, any of them, it's not just a one and done treatment. It does take a commitment to maintaining that system, the fire especially, and it could be every year for 5 years and then back off, and every 3 years, 5 years. Sometimes you might let it go 20 years between fire events. And once you get it to a point where it's open, maintaining the vegetation community and allowing some new oaks to grow, because those big trees aren't going to live forever, allowing new clusters of oaks to grow is going to be necessary to maintain that long term.
And based on your description, I'm going to guess that when you're thinning this, you want to make it so that when you're going through the thinning process of creating this oak savanna, generally speaking, you want to make it so the canopy is only about 30%, 70%.
For a true savanna, no more than 30% overall. And like I said, there's no hard definitive lines. Right. This was absolutely savanna, this was absolutely woodland. It's just a gradual change. So even within a savanna system, there might be a pocket of 80% canopy. Mm-hmm. In a closed forest system, there might be a little glade opening where it's 10% canopy. Yeah. So again, just working with the local site conditions. Don't try to force a treatment into an area where it's not conducive.
So very generally speaking, and this is we both know dangerous because every situation is different, but very generally speaking, you make sure it was an oak savanna to begin with. You go in there, you remove it, you remove the competition to the point where it's at least 70% open. You may, if you don't have warm season native grasses and forbs naturally occurring in the area yet, you may have to reinstitute some planting. And after that, generally speaking, you're looking at burns to maintain it.
And maybe some additional thinning might be required down the road. And I will point out, in true historical savannas, depending on past management, more often than not, that native vegetative, the remnant prairie, the remnant plants are still there.
They're there. They're just not germinating.
Yes.
Not, yep.
And they may be germinating. They may be growing. But like the wildflowers, for example, it takes a pretty good botanist to recognize all of the different flower species when it's just a single leaf. When that plant's just doing enough to survive, it's pretty easy to recognize them when they're actually flowering. Yeah. Once they get that sunlight and the fire. But before then, they might actually be there. They might be growing, but they're just not expressing themselves. So I would always, before you even consider the possibility of reseeding, get at least 2 fires through there, open the canopy, get that sunlight down, get that fire to help stimulate, and see what you've got before you start adding new seed.
It's, based on what I'm hearing you say, it's a lot like disking dirt. You disc that dirt, you know what? You're bringing up old seeds. And those old seeds, I mean, history has a way of reclaiming itself. And sure seems like that same thing's going on here, where you've got, generally speaking, unless it's been 300 years ago, you've got a seed bank there.
And it may not just be an actual seed bank. Like I said, it might be surviving plants. Sure. And it might be one plant here, one plant there. But over time, some of those plants may continue to express themselves. It may take them 6 or 8 or 10 years before you finally see a flower.
Well, and once they start flowering, what you're really hoping is
reseeding.
Exactly. Beautiful. Thank you, Matt.